Hello and welcome back. Once again, I'm your instructor, Lukas, and today we'll be examining how people understand and remember, giving you useful knowledge that we can build on to help you learn how to write in a way that makes it easy for your readers to understand and remember. You'll also learn to be a more effective reader, comprehending and recalling what you read. This video will focus on understanding how your brain absorbs and retains information. As you read about in your textbook, we have 100 billion brain nerve cells called neurons, which process and transmit information. There are a few important parts that exist on each neuron. The orange part is the main part of the cell body, which has dendrites extending from it. These dendrites each have synapses all over them, waiting to receive messages from other neurons. So then, on the left side of this slide, you can see the axon of a previous neuron with one of the axon tips connecting to the synapse on the dendrite of our main brain cell in the middle of the illustration. Similarly, if you look at the right side of the image, you can see the tips of the axon of our main cell connecting to and sending messages to the next cell via its dendrites. So then, your brain cells connect together with dendrites growing out of the main part of the brain cell to receive messages and an axon to send them. Let's look at another illustration of this. You can see the parts labeled here. The cell body is the main part of the cell. The dendrites, looking like tree branches, grow out of it. They receive messages through connections formed with other cells. Meanwhile, the cell sends its own messages to all the other cells that the branches of the axon connect to. You're welcome to pause the video to read the descriptions if you'd like, although the basic thing I want you to know is that the knowledge and thought are created through connections in your brain. The labels of the parts of the brain will not be used again after the next few slides. Now that you have a general idea about how brain cells connect, let's take a look at a representation of a small part of someone's neural network. Your brain has an incredible number of these connections that represent everything you know, think, and remember. As we experience and process those experiences, specific dendrites grow so that specific neurons are connected at specific places to create larger and more complex networks. And these networks literally are what we know and can do. The more we know, the more this network grows. You can see this illustrated in this scientific image of the growth of the neural network. When babies are born, they literally know nothing, not even how to move their own bodies, and have had very few experiences in the womb. You can see how explosively the networks develop, particularly as the child is intensely learning language and body control between the ages of 12 and 24 months. And if it's that thick in a 2-year-old, imagine how complex your own must be. Now, notice that it isn't the number of cells that's multiplied, only the connections between them. As you grow, learn, and experience, the brain constructs the neural networks from the most basic knowledge outward. Therefore, the best way to learn something new is to start with something that you can connect to personally or that builds off something you already know. This also means that if you don't have the foundation knowledge for a specific skill or subject, you won't be able to catch on easily, even if you're capable and intelligent, simply because you don't have the foundation. After all, in order to be able to receive a message or knowledge, the cell has to have dendrites that can connect with the cell transmitting the information. Without dendrites, there's nowhere for the axon tip to attach, and the message or knowledge cannot be transmitted. Learning grows dendrites. Like twigs that can only grow from a twig or a branch that's already there, so dendrites, new knowledge, can only grow from something that's already there, from something you already know. They provide the means through which the nervous system connects to and controls the other systems of the body, as well as all thought and memory. So, what do I want you to get from this? The point here is that knowledge is built, literally and physically, through connections. Bottom line, your brain is actually a network of connected bits of information, and paying attention to how that network works and how it is built have deep implications, which we'll be exploring on the following slides. The Ames room illusion shows how our brains control our perception and understanding of what we see. It appears that the people are changing size. Obviously, that's not the case, but the illusion works by making something appear to be a pattern that we recognize. In this case, a square room, with the windows and floor tiles reinforcing this interpretation. Take a moment longer to look at this before we see how it's done on the next slide. The Ames room illusion is created by having the left corner farther away from the camera than the right by slanting the back wall, and a ceiling that slopes upward toward that same corner, making it taller and farther away than the other side. You can see in the drawing how the room is built, with the viewer standing at the window seen on the lower right, so that the back wall is slanted rather than perpendicular to the viewer. The reason this illusion works is that we base our interpretation of what we see on the patterns from our past experiences. All or nearly all the rooms you've been in or seen in your life have either been square or rectangular, so our brain uses that pattern to interpret what we see, matching the pattern communicated by our eyes with similar ones from past experiences. Let's look at another way in which our brain's reliance on patterns learned from experience can trick us. As the Ames rooms demonstrates, what we call seeing is not automatic. It involves the mind as well as the eyes, a mind that has been trained to look for meaning by matching what we see to patterns or blueprints learned from experience or schema. Even a picture such as this one, where it's totally obvious how your perceptions are being distorted, feels strange to look at. Your perceptions are based on patterns learned from past behavior, since you have to interpret what you see in order to make sense of it. This street art by an artist named Edgar Muller also uses the patterns our brains have learned for judging perspective to fool us, just like the Ames room did. Even though we know that this has to be a flat street, you can even see a manhole cover on the left, it's still hard not to be fooled by the illusion. It's easy to see what's going on when you see it step by step, but when presented with the finished product, our experiences are so powerful and our brains are so reliant on the patterns learned from those experiences that we can be fooled even when we know it's a trick and how it's done. Responding to a visual image is not as automatic as it seems, as these examples showed. Seeing is interpretation, a learned behavior. This is true not only of visual texts, but of written ones as well. Whether we are reading visual or verbal texts, we're always engaged in the process of constructing meaning. The words, pictures, and other signs are associated in the mind with pre-existing mental categories and patterns that are converted into thoughts. Reading is more than just pouring information from the text into your memory. Reading is a dynamic process. When you read a book or watch a TV show, your brain is busy decoding what you see, assimilating new messages into the established structure of our brains, and changing the old ideas to fit new information. We relate what we see and read to past experiences, comparing the new text to what we already know, making interpretations, analyzing, predicting, and evaluating. Jokes and riddles can also reveal to us how these patterns operate by working against them in unexpected ways. For instance, in the first riddle, 5 men are trying to get under the same umbrella, but one doesn't fit. Yet he doesn't get wet. How can that be? Go ahead and take a moment to think about it. The answer lies in our assumptions. We are told that 5 men are trying to get under the same umbrella. We know that umbrellas are typically used to protect someone from rain, and the reason many people would try to fit under one umbrella is to avoid a downpour. However, the answer to the riddle is that it is not raining. Our brains filled in part of the expected answer, where an umbrella being used means rain. In the second riddle, we're told that a man rode into town on Friday. He stabled his horse and stayed for 3 days, and then on the 4th day, he rode out of town on Friday. How can that be? Again, take a moment to think about it. The answer here again lies in our interpretation. We know that when something happens, quote, on Friday, that refers to the day of the week. However, the answer to the riddle is that the horse's name is Friday. I think that the last example is the most interesting since it shows how society has changed over time. The riddle says that a man and his son are driving in their car when they're hit by a tractor trailer. The father dies instantly. The son is badly injured and is rushed to the hospital by paramedics. As he's being wheeled into the operating room, the surgeon takes one look at the boy and says, "I can't operate on him. He's my son." How is that possible? Now, when this was originally told in the 60s, it was a very difficult riddle. The answer was that the doctor is a woman. She's the boy's mother. The reason that the riddle was difficult is that so few women doctors existed back then. So the pattern based on experience, the schema, is that the doctor would be a man. By the 80s or 90s, this riddle was fairly easy since women doctors were much, much more common. However, I think the most interesting thing about this riddle is that I read an article about it wherein a child from today was told the riddle and he didn't hesitate to give his answer. It's the boy's other dad. We can see that his pattern of experience includes two gay men with a child as something normal enough that it occurs to him immediately. So your experiences dictate how you interpret and respond. We can see an even more humorous example of this in the note left on the fridge from a man to a woman. It says, "Someone from the colleges called. They said that the Pabst beer was normal. I didn't even know you liked beer." We can see what's going on here. Obviously, the man is unfamiliar with the gynecologist, so he interpreted it as colleges. He also had no idea what a pap smear is, so his brain picked the thing he was familiar with that sounded the closest, Pabst beer. Probably the mention of colleges contributed to that, since colleges are infamous for having lots of drinking, and we can see how your own knowledge and experiences, and lack of other experiences and knowledge, can change the meaning of a message. We can see how the man taking this message was comparing what he heard to what he knew. Take a moment to read the image shown. It was obvious how the background knowledge of the man taking the message in the last slide shaped how he experienced that message. Our experience is shaped by our internal models. An artist who has 30 different words for the colors of the spectrum might see colors differently than someone who only has 7 words, even though their vision might be better. Or, if a tree surgeon, an artist, and a lumberjack all see a picture of a tree, they'll notice different things about it, a concept we'll discuss in more detail later when we talk about selection. Most people do indeed read the picture caption incorrectly due to the mental expectations of English imposing itself on what's actually written. This is one reason why it's hard to see mistakes when you are proofreading. We tend to read what we expect to see based off our patterns of knowledge instead of what's on the page. This is why having someone else read can be helpful, since they notice the missing information, whereas you're filling it in your head, since you know what you expected to say. Here is another example about how powerful our minds can be in controlling how we see or understand things. First, pause the video and read the text on the screen. I don't know about you, but after being primed by seeing the image of Morgan Freeman, I couldn't help but hear the words in his voice, since his specific voice is distinct and strongly associated with his image. Clearly, reading is not just a matter of adding up word meanings. We can also see this demonstrated by doing a short activity, which will begin on the next slide. First, you will pause the video while you read through the passage one time and one time only. Then, you will listen and take whatever notes you would like as I read it to you. Once you have done both of those steps, you'll be trying to recreate the passage as close to word for word as possible. For now, once the slide appears, pause the video, read the passage one time only one time, and then restart the video. Pause and read the passage one time. Now that you've done that, I will read the passage with a short pause between each sentence, and you're welcome to take whatever notes you can while I'm reading it to you. However, do not look at the screen while listening. He is worried because there are many things that could go wrong. If the balloons popped, the sound wouldn't be able to carry, since everything would be too far away from the correct floor. A closed window would also prevent the sound from carrying, since the building she lives in is well insulated. Since the whole operation depends upon the steady flow of electricity, a break in the middle of the wire would also cause problems. Of course, he could shout, but his voice might not carry that far, and he shouldn't sound harsh or strained. An additional problem is that a string could break on the instrument. Then there would be no accompaniment to the message. It is clear that the best situation would involve less distance. Then there would be fewer potential problems. With face-to-face contact, the least number of things could go wrong. Now, I invite you to pause the video, minimize your browser window, and try to rewrite the passage exactly as closely as you can without referring to this image. As you discovered, if you tried to write this word for word after simply reading it once and hearing it once, it would be quite difficult. However, the addition of the picture makes everything click, since it allows you to see the pattern it matches. You now have a context to see what is going on. It's a serenade. It isn't exactly your typical serenade, which is done with an acoustic guitar or a boombox, but we have everything we need for it to fit the pattern. We all know there are a few things you have to have for the situation to count as a serenade. First, you have to have the one doing the serenading and the one listening. If there's only one person involved, it's not a serenade. In addition, a serenade has to involve music, usually guitar of some sort, but sometimes a boombox or something less traditional. However, if you don't have music, you don't have a serenade. Finally, the message has to be one of love. The purpose of the serenade is to try to win over the listener romantically. If you're playing music outside someone's window to try and get them to buy you a new cell phone, it's not a serenade. So then, we have a blueprint or script about how we expect something to go and what elements it needs to have in order to count. This blueprint or script is called a schema, and it helps provide us with a framework for understanding the things we experience. No one can remember all the details. Your schema tells you which are the most important ones, and those are what you file away in your brain. As this activity showed, when readers read, they'll try, even if unconsciously, to fit everything together into a consistent pattern of relationships, either using one they already know or modifying one to fit. You don't just add up the meanings of the words to understand. You try to connect what you're reading with a familiar pattern. When we read or listen or observe, we rely on previous knowledge and experience to guide our comprehension, and you have the ability to tap that knowledge more effectively by trying, thinking things through consciously and making connections. So then, a reader's schema, or organized knowledge of the world, lets them understand, learn, and remember everything, including ideas and details in a text. As we are overwhelmed with experiences, our mind automatically starts categorizing things and making connections, creating these schemas or blueprints. For example, you may have noticed that the passage was a list of potential problems, which would have been helpful for remembering them more effectively. Another important idea to take away from this activity is that your readers need to know what you're talking about to be able to understand, so make sure it's clear. You need to give context and make things clear. Don't assume readers will automatically know and give too little information. let's pause for a moment to look a little bit more specifically at what a schema does and what it is. The official definition of a schema is the organization of knowledge about a particular concept. The schema contains the features or attributes that are associated with a category membership. Another way to think about it is that our brain works by grouping and connecting concepts to achieve understanding and make reasonable assumptions and interpretations. We use these schemata built from prior knowledge to evaluate, predict, and identify. Each structure of grouped and related concepts is called a schema. More than one are called schemata. To make this a little clearer, let's look briefly at a few of the different kinds of schemata. We have a lot of them, but I thought I would mention a few of the primary ones. Event schemata can also be called cognitive scripts. These are how we expect a certain event to go, or how we deal with something. For example, if you go to a restaurant or an 8-year-old's birthday party, you know in general how things are going to happen and what it's going to be like. If you're thirsty, you get something to drink. If you're tired, you might rest, or you might eat some candy. You have certain ways you respond when someone says, "How are you?" These can all be seen as processes, practices, or ways in which we typically approach tasks, problems, and events or situations. To put it scientifically, they are the programs we call upon when faced with a certain stimulus. Unsurprisingly, object schemata govern our expectations about objects. Imagine you're looking through a furniture catalog. You see the weirdest looking chair that you have ever seen in your life. However, you still know it's a chair because you know what something needs to have to be identified as a chair and what it can't have. A beanbag and the electric chair are both chairs, but a footstool or an ottoman isn't, even though you can sit on them. This is due to your object schema for chairs, which can help you identify whether something is or isn't a chair, even if you've never seen that object before. A person schema is about the attributes of a particular individual, such as skills, competencies, and values. This often takes the form of the personality we attribute to that person, which can be based on superficial things like clothing or demeanor when we don't know someone, or more extensive experiences with how the person behaves when we do. A self-schema is generalizations or beliefs about yourself, separate from the present situation. This is essentially your self-concept, which is in essence perceptions of yourself in terms of traits, competencies, and values. Self-efficacy is a type of self-schema that applies to how good you think you will be at a particular task. Role schemata contain sets of role expectations. That is, how do we expect an individual occupying a certain role to behave? For example, how does a grandmother act? A waiter at a high-class restaurant? A banker? A gangster? A cheerleader? A 16-year-old boy? If you think about it, you have expectations for all of these roles. There are other types of schemata as well, like emotional schemata that allow us to interpret our feelings. Are you happy or mad, frustrated or irritated? Schemata are constructed through specific experiences. They begin as a simple network and develop into more complex structures that are more organized and contain more characteristics. For example, a toddler might think that any animal with 4 legs and a tail is a dog, whereas an older child knows the difference between dogs and cats. Schemata involving behavior and action can be acquired either directly or indirectly. You can acquire your blueprint or expectations directly by experiencing the process with confirmation through repetition. For example, you've probably eaten at restaurants lots of times, so you have had your experiences about how a normal restaurant visit goes confirmed. You can also build a schema through an indirect experience, such as reading or listening to a story or myth, watching a movie, hearing about it from another person, seeing someone else experience it, and so on. Since a schema is kind of like a blueprint, indicating what is expected, you can create a visual representation of a schema by listing the elements. What does a birthday party include? A visit to a restaurant? What's a dog? Now, when you eat at a specific restaurant or attend a specific birthday party or see a specific dog, you don't have to memorize everything about it. There are certain qualities or elements that you know have to be included. These qualities are like slots or blanks that can be filled in. For example, being seated in a restaurant might happen in a variety of ways, from seating yourself at the bar to having a host or hostess seat you at a booth or a table. Information that fits the slot is readily learned with little mental effort, and the underlying form doesn't have to be relearned each time. You draw on the existing foundation knowledge. Some slots are more or less important than others, and our schema includes that information. We can process information that doesn't fit the stereotype as long as it fits the slot. For example, you can have a serenade accompanied by a xylophone or no accompaniment at all and still be a serenade, but you have to have someone being sung to, because without an audience, it doesn't qualify as a serenade. You can also tell how a person thinks and what their experiences have been like by the schema connections they have. Psychologists will use free association to tap into this because what you'll come up with are the connections that are the strongest. This illustration is drawn from one that I did in class when I asked people to shout out the basic characteristics of a dog. The person who said slobber as one of the identifying aspects of dogginess has some obvious differences from the person who said cuddly. So, why is schema theory important? What are the benefits of our minds working this way? There are many. First, and most importantly, schemata organize and sort through your received experiences and knowledge in a manageable way by relating ideas together so they can be searched in an orderly fashion. Just like a library or a grocery store uses organization and categories so that you can find any particular item in a short time, your brain has a system as well. But this system can be useful in many other ways than simply searching out information. Schemata also help us learn information faster and remember it better by providing the underlying form or blueprint that doesn't have to be relearned each time. You draw on the existing foundation knowledge. A schema provides a slot that each piece of information fits into, so you can remember via connections rather than by memorizing every detail, which is nearly impossible to achieve. For instance, there is a slot for the main entree in a fine dining restaurant schema and a slot for the cake in the birthday party schema. A study was done showing how schema can help memory. People were given a list of people and food items and were asked to memorize which food item went with which person. One group was told that it was each person's grocery list. The other group was told that this was a list of what each person had at a restaurant dinner. Guess which group did better? The restaurant group, because there are fewer items that fit into the slots. If you're eating at a restaurant, you'll know you'll have a main course, perhaps an appetizer and dessert. On the other hand, a grocery list could have almost anything on it. Information that fits the slot is readily learned with little mental effort. Scientists know this, which is why the vast amount of knowledge in any scientific field is subdivided into different classifications. Schemata also allow us to communicate from a shared frame of reference without having to specify every single detail. We can infer or fill in the blanks of what's not said. For example, if I said to my friend that I went to a restaurant and got steak and mashed potatoes, my friend would automatically know what basic style of restaurant and that I went through the series of events included in a typical restaurant visit that we looked at a few slides ago. They also direct our attention, letting us know what is more or less important, helping you recognize and separate trivial information from the important or unique information. This means you can pay less attention to trivia, saving time, and having more brain power for remembering the important stuff. Since no one can notice every detail about a situation or thing or remember an entire text, skilled readers are able to pay more attention to important details and less to others, making reading faster and more efficient. Since a schema includes criteria of importance, what's important and what's not, it enables the reader to produce summaries that include significant information and leave out trivial information. We saw this in action with the burglar homebuyer study on pages 52 to 53 of your textbook. A schema also allows inferential elaboration. No text is completely explicit. There's always some information which is implicit or unstated. Inferential elaboration allows us to go beyond what is literally stated in the text and helps you make guesses about things that didn't get written down, reading much more than what a sentence explicitly says. It also allows inferential reconstruction. When there's a gap in your memory, you can fill it in with a reasonable guess based on your understanding of the situation and the usual or stereotypical answer for what you don't remember. Now, the easiest and clearest way to see schemas' effects is when they break down, which helps us see how it goes when they work smoothly. You were able to see demonstrated how our schemata shape our memory, understanding, and perception in the study discussed in the textbook. In the study, people from India and people from America read two letters, one about an American wedding and one about a wedding in India. There are substantial differences in the two cultures with regards to weddings. We can see the various functions in action in the results of this study. Again, a schema helps us organize and store information so we have an easier time learning and remembering it. A schema identifies which details are more or less important and their significance, and it helps us to infer and reconstruct information. In the study, each group spent less time reading what was for them the native passage. This shows how having a template or being able to fill in the blanks or slots can enhance reading speed. The familiarity with the basic event being discussed in the letter allowed the participants to take in the information more quickly. Then, when asked to recall everything they could about each letter, the participants from India remembered more of the Indian text, and Americans remembered more of the American one, showing how having a schema for the event can help us remember it better. When asked to recall the letter about the other culture's wedding, not only did each group recall fewer details and have more errors in what they did recall, but they also showed more culturally inappropriate distortions. For example, one passage in the American letter read, "Did you know that Pam was going to wear her grandmother's wedding dress? That gave her something that was old and borrowed too. It was made of lace over satin with very large puff sleeves and looked absolutely charming on her." One participant from India said this, "She was looking all right, except the dress was too old and out of fashion." This person from India inferred that the dress was out of fashion because Indians attach importance to displays of social status at weddings, like wearing an up-to-date and fashionable sari. Therefore, the schema that rated the importance of the details did not match the situation, creating a misunderstanding. In another part of the study, different groups of Indians and Americans read the letters and rated the details by importance. The Americans rated the information about ritual and ceremony more important in both, and the Indians rated the details about financial and social status as more important in both, since those are the more important aspects of a wedding in each culture. American weddings emphasize tradition and the ceremony. Indian weddings are primarily occasions to display wealth and social status. Now that you're more familiar with schema theory, it's time to finish up by discussing how we can use that knowledge. There are basically two ways to use schema knowledge as a writer: helping your readers to activate the correct schema and helping them to construct a new one. When you're discussing something that your reader already knows about, there are several methods you can use to help them activate a schema that already exists. And when you're teaching them something new, many similar techniques can help them to build the new one from their existing knowledge. One method to help your readers is to include an introduction to the material. This helps your readers build or activate that foundation they need to be able to follow what you're saying. This is why so often essays begin with something people already know or are familiar with before going on to new ideas. And it is also why I started this book with a review of information about college-level reading and writing, and essays in particular. Another method is to connect or relate material to experiences that your reader can relate to. You want to remind them of something they've experienced that is relevant to what you're talking about. For instance, if you're trying to argue that school uniforms should be implemented, you might remind readers of getting made fun of for something they were wearing as a kid. You want to explain new things in terms of things readers already understand, such as how people explaining how electricity behaves often liken it to how water acts in a stream bed. Most people don't know much about electricity, but they're generally familiar with how water acts in a river. As another example, if a British person is explaining the game of rugby to an American, it would be helpful to compare it to the similar game of football, which the Americans will be familiar with, so that instead of memorizing everything, they can create a new sequence based off of similarities and differences to a concept for which they already have a schema. In this way, making connections to things the readers already know or understand can strengthen your writing immeasurably. Emphasizing connections within the material is also important. Using transition words and explicitly connecting back can be helpful techniques. For example, in the next chapter on reading, I'll be connecting back by pointing out how various reading strategies are built upon schema activation methods. For instance, pre-reading is a way of activating your schema, getting it ready to be built upon. One of the most important things you can do is to explain the relevance and relationships of details that are included. For example, in one study that was done, second graders read a textbook that gave lots of details about how Native Americans lived, including what their houses were made out of and how they were shaped, but didn't explain why. Another group read a textbook that explained how the house's type and materials related to the environment, such as pointing out that houses in the warm areas helped keep things cool, whereas one in the cold places kept things warm, and that people who were nomadic had houses that were easily portable. The group that read that textbook, where the connections were explained, remembered the material better. Finally, if you're creating a new schema for something, include defining characteristics to help with the creation of categories. If you say a dog has 4 legs, fur, and a tail, then cows, squirrels, and many other mammals would fit as well. Make sure the characteristics are specific. Thank you for watching. I hope that this overview was helpful and illuminating and has helped you come to a new understanding of the processes of learning and remembering. Please don't hesitate to contact me with any question that you may have about the material. I'm always happy to help.